Hey there, I'm Ryan Boehme, and you're tuning into So You Want to Teach Percussion. This video series is designed particularly for my current Percussion Methods students. Since they aren't able to have a typical Percussion Methods experience due to the current global pandemic, these videos are designed to give them a foundation of the technique outside of class time so that we have more time to play when we're together. But I also hope this video series can be helpful to any music educators out there. Today, we're going to continue talking about keyboards. If you haven't seen part 1, click the link up here to check it out. In that video, you'll learn all about playing position and playing technique. So now that we know some general techniques for playing keyboard instruments, it's important to know the differences between each instrument in the family. And it's also important for your students to be able to determine which mallets are going to help them be most successful for their keyboard parts. In this video, we're going to dig into both of those concepts. We're going to talk about keyboard types and mallet choice. So grab your mallets, and let's get started. First, we're going to talk about keyboard types. There are two general subfamilies within the keyboard family of percussion instruments: wood instruments and metal instruments. Wooden instruments are going to be pretty resonant, but there's typically a pretty quick decay, especially for smaller bars. Metal instruments, on the other hand, are going to ring for a much longer time, which can be nice for legato passages. But sometimes this can be less than desirable, especially if the resonance of one note rings at the same time as the resonance of another note and starts to clash. So let's go over the different types of keyboard instruments and consider the materials, the ranges, and the anatomy of each one. The instrument I used in part 1 is a marimba. Marimbas have the widest range of any keyboard percussion instrument. The most common ranges are 4 octaves, 4 1/3 octaves, 4 1/2 octaves, and 5 octaves. Marimbas are used very commonly in solo repertoire and percussion ensemble, and they become increasingly popular in concert music. That means this is an instrument that your students are going to need to practice often. Most concert marimbas make use of rosewood or padauk bars. However, marimbas with acoustalon bars are very common for any outdoor band activities. These will be more durable for varying weather conditions, and they'll sound fairly close to rosewood or padauk. So having a marimba with acoustalon bars can be a wise investment for your music program. This is a xylophone. Xylophones also contain wooden keys, but the keys are tuned a bit differently than marimba bars, and they're typically thicker than most marimba bars. Because of this, the xylophone will sound an octave higher than written. The most common ranges for xylophone are 3 octaves and 3 1/2 octaves. Xylophones are occasionally used as solo instruments, particularly in the ragtime genre. They also show up often in percussion ensemble and wind band and orchestral repertoire. Concert xylophones typically contain rosewood, padauk, or fiberglass bars. But like I mentioned with marimbas, xylophones with acoustalon bars are best for outdoor band activities. Now let's talk about the metal instruments. The characteristic sound for these instruments is typically a sound that's more resonant than wooden instruments, with a much more gradual decay. To achieve this, most metal instruments have a pedal, which is going to either create sustain or prevent sustain, depending on the instrument. So let's check out our metal keyboard instruments. The glockenspiel, or the bells, is a very common instrument in wind band and orchestral repertoire. Glockenspiels contain thin metal keys. The most typical range is 2 1/2 octaves. But as you can see in this clip, there are also glockenspiels in the 3 1/3 octave range. No matter the range, bells will always sound 2 octaves higher than written. Some bells, like the one I'm using here, have a pedal. The most characteristic sound for glockenspiel is a resonant, sustained sound, whether or not your instrument has a pedal. Therefore, glockenspiel pedals serve as a muffling mechanism, as you can see in this clip. When I press down on the pedal, it dampens the vibrating keys. Since glockenspiel keys ring for a long time, this can be useful to add clarity to a busy passage, or to match the articulation of the rest of the ensemble. If your bells don't have a pedal, your students can also dampen keys with their hands or their arms. This doesn't need to be done super often, but it can be a helpful technique when the glockenspiel needs to match the duration of another instrument in the ensemble. This is a vibraphone. Vibraphones are most commonly seen in the 3 octave variety, but you can also find them in 3 1/2 octave and 4 octave ranges. Vibraphones are versatile instruments. They can be found in solo repertoire, percussion ensemble, band, orchestra, and even jazz. All vibraphones contain a pedal, and unlike the pedals you'll occasionally find on glockenspiels, pressing down a vibraphone pedal releases a damper bar sitting underneath the keys, which allows the keys to ring for a long time. Playing with the pedal up is also a sound that is commonly asked for. In this case, the keys are resting on the damper bar, so the sound is going to be more staccato. Most vibraphones also contain some kind of motor mechanism that activates fans that are typically attached to the tops of the resonators. With the motor on, these fans open and close repeatedly, creating a wah-wah effect. Most motors have adjustable speed, allowing the performers to customize their vibrato effects. The Mallet Omega vibraphone I'm using here is a little different. When the motor is on, there's a thin bar that circles over and away from the resonators in both manuals. Here's what it sounds like with a slow motor. And here's what it sounds like with a fast motor. Students won't typically need to worry about using the motor unless a composer specifically requests it, but you can experiment with adding the motor at a very slow speed, even if the composer doesn't ask for it. It can add a nice subtle contrast that may be suitable in some musical contexts. Finally, we have the chimes, or tubular bells. Chimes are typically found in a 1.5 octave or 1 2/3 octave range. These are heard often in wind band and orchestral repertoire, and occasionally in percussion ensemble. Chime pedals work the same way as vibraphone pedals. Press the pedal down to allow each tube to resonate freely. But like glockenspiel, the characteristic chime sound is a resonant, sustained sound. So your students will want to aim for a sustained sound while they play, but they can release the pedal to cut off the resonance when needed. If I keep the pedal down the whole time, the resonance of each note will bleed into the next note, so the passage might not be super clear. Have your students experiment with different pedalings to bring out passages that should be heard with less resonance. You'll notice that for this E major scale, I'm using manual sticking, where I keep one hand down by the naturals and one hand up by the accidentals. Since moving around the chimes can be tricky, it's helpful to restrict one hand to each manual when it's musically appropriate. Also, notice how I'm striking the chimes. The head of my chime hammer moves horizontally into the cap on the top of each tube. If I play like this, hitting the cap at an angle, I'm going to get a soft, thuddy sound that isn't characteristic of a desired chime sound. When I'm playing chimes, I like to keep my music stand between me and the chimes. That way I can see everything I'm playing on the instrument, and I can still see my conductor by looking through the chimes. I've seen some percussionists play chimes like this, with the chimes set up to the side. I understand that this makes the performer more visible to the audience, but having the music in one spot and the playing target in another spot can make things difficult and uncomfortable. Also, setting the chimes up this way restricts some of the natural sound of the instrument. Listen to the difference when I put the chimes back in front of me. And that's the majority of the keyboard types you'll need to have in your band room. Having at least one of each of these keyboards is going to allow your students to cover most or all of the parts they'll ever need to cover in band. And it'll also allow your students to experience lots of percussion ensemble and solo repertoire. Finally, we're going to talk about mallet choice. Similarly to what I discussed in the bass drum and timpani episodes, there are tons of mallets to choose from. And the fact that there's so many different types of keyboard instruments means that there are even more mallets than you might think. And while our mallet choice is going to affect our sound, it's also going to affect how the instruments respond to being played. For instance, marimba bars are typically very thin in the middle of the bar. So if your students play with mallets that are too hard, they run the risk of cracking or damaging the bar, which means that you then have to replace the bar. So I'm going to show you a few types of mallets that you're going to want to have in your band room so that your students can achieve good sounds without risking instrument damage. For marimba, your students will typically use yarn mallets. These particular mallets are in the medium-hard range, so they're very usable across the whole range of the instrument, but they're typically most effective between the middle and high ranges. These are soft mallets, which are going to be most effective in the low to middle ranges. These obviously provide a softer attack, which is going to make them very useful for rolls and legato passages. For vibraphone, your students are going to typically use mallets with yarn or cord. Unlike the thin wooden bars on marimba, we don't have to worry so much about damaging the metal bars on a vibraphone when we're using hard cord mallets. So we have more flexibility to use harder mallets, like these that I'm using in this clip. There's a heavy articulation, but there's still plenty of tone and resonance. With softer yarn mallets, I can get a sound that's less focused on the articulation, which may be desirable for quieter contexts. Softer mallets will also provide more flexibility for softer or heavier touches on the instrument, which can be helpful for achieving a variety of good sounds. Xylophone and glockenspiel will typically be played with plastic or rubber mallets. Plastic mallets can be found in softer or harder varieties, but they'll all generally have a strong articulation that will allow xylophones and glockenspiels to be easily heard. Hard plastic mallets can potentially damage xylophone bars, so your students will need to be careful with their xylophone mallet selections. Rubber mallets can be a nice substitute for passages where you want the xylophone or bells to sound more subdued, maybe to complement what's going on in the ensemble. These are hard rubber mallets, so they don't sound too different from plastic mallets. But your students can also experiment with softer rubber mallets to achieve less articulation and more tone. Chimes are going to typically be played with hammers. The hammers I'm using here are rawhide hammers, which provide a nice balance between tone and articulation. There are harder hammers out there, with heads typically made of either PVC material or plastic. In general, any of these types of chime hammers are going to allow your percussionists to cover all their chime parts effectively. And there are so many more mallets to choose from other than those. You can encourage your students to branch out and buy their own mallets for different keyboard instruments, which is just going to expand their sound palette even more. I hope this video has helped you gain a better understanding of keyboard types and mallet choice. Making your students aware of the different ranges and anatomy of keyboard instruments is going to help them figure out their keyboard parts. And knowing which mallets to use for each keyboard is going to help them make good sounds without damaging the valuable instruments in your band room. That's it for now. I'm Ryan Boehme, and thanks for tuning in to So You Want to Teach Percussion.